Okay, I'll stop sharing the screen in a few seconds, but let's leave the program there so people who tune in know they are in the right place. So thank you for joining us tonight. Sarah, can you hear me? Can people hear? Yes, okay, good. Thank you for joining us tonight. This program is sponsored by the Stanford Deans of Engineering, Humanities and Sciences, and Medicine, by Computing Study, Continuing Studies, and Chemical Engineering. LASER stands for Leonardo Art Science Evening Rendezvous. Go to www.lasertalks.com if you want to know more. After we moved online, I also like to call them the LAST dialogues, where LAST stands for Life, Art, Science, Tech. Anyway, if you missed the previous ones, you can find the videos at lasertalks.com. We've had, since we moved online, we've had discussions with artists, biologists, physicists, historians, archaeologists, and I probably forget many. Again, check out lasertalks.com for past events, the videos, and the future program. Usually a laser is 3 or 4 speakers on different topics, but tonight we have something special. I really wanted to do something special for James Joyce Ulysses, and luckily Professor Cole from Columbia University was available to spend some time with us and discuss and celebrate the 100th anniversary of its publication. A notoriously difficult text, Ulysses is also considered one of the most important and influential works of the 20th century. We'll examine what made it so groundbreaking back then and what makes it relevant today. Now, a brief introduction about Professor Sarah Cole. She's Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University, and she's the Dean of Humanities at Columbia University. She specializes in literary modernism, and she's the co-founder of the Modernist Seminar and publishes widely on literary modernism and on war and peace. As Dean, she founded and directs the Humanities War and Peace Initiative and the Climate Humanities Initiative at Columbia. She's the author of 3 books, and talking about art and science, if you like science fiction, one of the books is about H.G. Wells. Anyway, an extensive bio with a link to her webpage is at lasertalks.com or wherever you registered. Now, the format. So I'll let Professor Cole give an introduction, and then I proposed to her a little game where I will throw keywords at her, and she will elaborate how those topics are treated in Ulysses. Anybody can ask questions. If you post them in the Q&A, you make my life easier. There's Q&A and chat, whichever. I will check the Q&A first. So it's a special laser, only one topic tonight, but I think it deserves special attention. Okay, if I haven't forgotten anything, Sarah, the podium is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Piero, thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. Greetings from New York. I'm a Californian by birth and spent the first half of my life there, so 6 o'clock feels like around what it should be right now. But it's nice to be here with everybody. So yes, let's talk about Ulysses at 100. There is obviously a lot we can say. When I teach Ulysses, which I love to do, we spend 1 class on each episode, so that's 18 classes, and I never feel we come close to covering it. So I think in our 55 minutes, we will just treat this as a way of thinking about this wonderful and important book at 100. And I'm really happy to talk with all of you in the Q&A function about your questions and thoughts and where you are on Ulysses. So when the novel was published 100 years ago, it was a really big event. It was a watershed event. In a lot of ways, it was a scandal. The book was immediately banned. Actually, it was banned before it was censored, before it was fully published as a book. It was coming out serially. And when they got to chapter 7, which is the chapter in which Leopold Bloom, one of the two main characters, masturbates on the beach while looking at a young woman, that's when the press is shut down for this book. And as you probably know, it had a long, complicated history of getting itself finally unbanned. It was published in Paris by the great Sylvia Beach, and it has always been controversial in different ways since then. You should know, if you don't already, that Joyce was not a great hero in Ireland initially. There are a lot of anecdotes, and I always love to tell people having trouble getting things published that it took 100 publishers for Joyce to find someone to publish Dubliners, his first collection of stories, which was very troubling to the people of Dublin and Ireland more generally. Joyce didn't really become a hero. There was no statue of Joyce in Dublin, for just as an example, until 1990. And Dublin is a city of many statues and monuments. So it was a long and complicated relationship. He was, of course, in some ways embraced by many Irish readers and thinkers and writers. But as a figure, he really was, he stood in for a kind of universal or international or transnational modernism more than as a kind of Irish writer. And that's the way it was for a while. He was, of course, not in Ireland when he wrote Ulysses. And probably many of you know the anecdote that he wrote to a friend of his, Frank Budgeon, in which he said that if Dublin were destroyed, it could be recreated through his book, which has this encyclopedic desire to kind of map Dublin where he was not. And there is much evidence of him writing to many friends who were there to get all kinds of details about sort of at what hour the sun slants through on a given street, and so on, with all the many hundreds and thousands of details that constitute the novel. But he was living in Europe. And if you look at the novel, if you make it to the end, you'll find his little epigraph. He gives the dates, 1914 to 22, and then he gives to 21, and then he gives these 3 cities of Trieste, Zurich, and Paris. So not Dublin. And he was immediately, and this book was immediately understood to be a major event in literature and in literary modernism, which is the movement that we typically assign to these years in Europe and around the world. So we have Joyce, we have Virginia Woolf, we have people like William Faulkner a little bit later in the US. We have poets like Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. For Ezra Pound, it was The Wasteland, the poem published by T.S. Eliot in the same year, 1922, that was what he thought of as kind of the banner of their movement. But for many, including to some degree Pound, it was really Ulysses that came to represent this moment, this groundbreaking moment in literary history. And Eliot himself, in a famous short essay he wrote in 1923 called Ulysses, Order and Myth, himself declared Ulysses to be that work. I'll just read a line from that essay. He wrote, "I hold this book, that is Ulysses, to be the most important expression which the present age has found. It is a book to which we are all indebted and from which none of us can escape." If you know Eliot, that's a very Eliot kind of problem, to not be able to escape from it. So it is this big book that probably many of you have read or looked at or thought about reading or read some of. And it's not the size really, you can read longer books than this, in a lot less time. It's the density and the intensity, the difficulty, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But at its base, it's a story of a half-Jewish salesman, Leopold Bloom, strolling around Dublin on a single day, June 16th, 1904, cast as a new Odysseus and this as a new Odyssey, a modern epic. And it worked. It struck a chord, a major chord. So I guess the questions that I've been thinking about in this year of 2022, as we celebrate this anniversary and wonder what it means and how to think about Ulysses at 100, questions I would ask are, is it still shocking? Is it still difficult? Is it still new? Does it still shake up our worlds the way it seemed to do at the time? Why read it today? Do people read it today? How do they read it today? In what context and why? And I think about today's readership, which, in general is probably less tolerant of such an unbelievable welter of detail, of the time it takes to read this book, the time and the energy that has to be devoted to it. We think of ourselves as having shorter attention spans. This is a book for long attention spans. So the question is, what does it mean for today's readers to take that on? Why and how? Is it still inspiring? And if so, why and how? And I will say on the attention span and so on that, and I'd love to talk about teaching this book, which I do as often as I can. The last time I taught it, I realized was in 2016. But I will say that the students who take it on, and there are always a lot of them, they become very attached to it. And at the end of the class, I always ask, well, you're done. How do you feel? And they'll say things like, I'm going to miss it. I don't know what it's going to be like not to be carrying this book around. My friends have been laughing at me. I always have this heavy tome. I've been living in this world. And so it's a world that you absorb yourself in. And I think readers and students today actually really find that wonderful and different from much that they do in their ordinary lives, which is less, which tends to come in smaller pieces, whether it's a 140 character tweet or something else. So I guess what I want to say first is that I do think it's still difficult, and I do think it's still shocking, and I do think it's still troubling, though not, I think, in the way perhaps that it was received in 1922. It is still thrilling to me and to many others. I think it is still moving, and I guess I would say above all, it's still worth it. Some of the attributes that make it thrilling and moving and interesting and troubling and problematic and difficult and compelling, some of those attributes are probably the same as they were 100 years ago. That is, the same kinds of things would move a reader today as it might have done 100 years ago. Others will have changed, not only in the 100 years, but since 1982. I think I started reading Ulysses when I was in college, so probably the mid 80s. Or since 2002, every 20 years, maybe we want to go back and think, how are we reading Ulysses now and why and what's changed? And I think that it is a book that lives with its time. My students have issues with it today that they did not have 20 years ago, that I did not have 20 years before that. They're different ones. And we can talk about some of those if you're interested in it. But I will say that it is a book that moves and lives with its time. And that's part of what's so amazing and miraculous about it. So just to give a few examples, I would say the primary one, and maybe this will be interesting for this group that is, I understand, to be very interested in arts and technology and science and literature and so on altogether, is that this book, if you think about the internet and all it offers, I would say that Ulysses was built for the digital age. It is a perfect book for the digital age. And that's for a couple of reasons. One of those reasons is that, it's full of things. It's full of songs, it's full of music, it's full of poetry, it's full of opera and images and places. It's a map, and it's full of maps, and it's full of real people. And so all you have to do now is click on Joyce, go to the website, you can click on these songs and you can hear them. And that is not, in the case of this book, that is a massive addition to it. It's not somehow taking away from the sort of special experience of reading. This is a book that is all about sending out every kind of feeler. Actually, the word feeler is used twice in the first few chapters, and I think that's probably relevant. But anyway, sending out all these feelers into the world and bringing them in. It's a network. It's a book that builds connection after connection after connection. So both at the kind of practical level and kind of at the genetic level, the level of what it is, it's a book that is perfect for the era that we live in terms of our digital and networked world. It's a book that is always about more than itself. And again, I think that's something that's harder to manage when you just have volumes of books lying around your desk. What I mean by that, a few thds by that, but as soon as he'd finished it, Joyce immediately sent a kind of schema, actually two different schemas, just to make things more complicated, to two different friends, one an Italian friend named Renati, and then to Frank Budgeon, another English friend. And these immediately became part of the reading experience. For my generation, it was this book, Dawn Gifford, and Bob Seidman's book, Ulysses Annotated, which I still require my students to get, because I find it actually impossible to read without a guidebook like this. It's almost every other word. I don't know what's going on with it without that, and neither do they. So it's always come with a kind of infrastructure, a kind of library. There's an episode in the middle of the book, about a third of the way through, that takes place in a library. And it is a book of libraries. It's a book in which you kind of bring your reading with you, what you've read, but you also accrue as you go. And it has its own kind of library that's ever growing. It's made also for the global age. Every time you read this book, you notice new things. So when I was reading it in college, I was not so interested in the globalism of Ulysses. But now when I read it, I'm so fascinated by the fact that not only is the Leopold Bloom himself half Jewish of a Hungarian descent, his grandfather was Hungarian, his wife Molly was born on Gibraltar, and just a city, the city of Dublin, not a kind of provincial Irish city in some traditional way, but a city that is teeming with people who are half this and half that, who are dreaming of life in, you know, the Levant, who are thinking of futures and pasts in all kinds of places in the world, and where trade and ideas and music and art and history are crisscrossing. It's a world in transit in and across the globe. There are a lot of wonderful lines about walking through history and kind of finding yourself. Both Stephen Dedalus, who is the other primary protagonist, along with Leopold Bloom in the novel, the young Joyce himself, he's modeled on him very closely. Both of them have lines about that, but it's not just walking through history in some static place, but there's a sense of the kind of currents of the world washing through this place. And it's a book that's very interested in the sea and water and all forms of circulation. Circulation is one of its dominant metaphors. Actually, there's so many dominant metaphors, it's hard to say, but it's one of many. So the point is that these are things that seem very resonant to our global world, with the multiple languages and traditions and all of these wanderers and people who are not pure anything. If you had to pick one creed for this novel, it would probably be the creed of impurity. The enemies and villains of this book are within the book are those who demand purity. And the book is about impurity. It's about everything that is partially this and partially that refuses to subscribe to those visions. It's about the messiness of human life and history, and its manyness and its imperfections. It fits well, I think, with the particular way that our own culture does inter-arts things. You know, when it came out, I think the high cultural apparatus of Wagner and Mozart and Shakespeare and contemporary Irish writers and everybody, and St. Thomas Aquinas and Augustine, and Stephen Dedalus is an exceedingly learned person. So everything that washes through his mind all day long is a kind of welter and overflow of erudition. So there's all of that. But one of the things that I think that makes it so appropriate for our own time is that actually it's a total mix of high and low culture, of popular arts, whether it's, you know, the stage, the popular stage, music of all kinds. Its languages might dwell sometimes on Shakespeare, but it also dwells in the language of the streets. In fact, there's a chapter called Oxen of the Sun, which traces the evolution of the English language, and it ends in this kind of impossible slang. It's actually it's one of the hardest chapters to read in the whole book, in part because you can't get through this crazy kind of weird, sort of Americanish slang that Joyce is more or less making up. But the point is, the comics, the way our own culture is comfortable moving, having comics adaptations or a fancy opera or a TV show, film, of course. And there's so many ways in which I think in 2022, we cross these barriers. We're quite uncomfortable, I think, as a culture with things sticking to their place. And that's really in the ethos of Ulysses. So all of these are ways in which I think it's an appropriate book, a book that lives today and feels that it speaks to us. It still excites, it still confuses, it still fills many of us, I think my students, with wonder. I wanted to say one or two more things and then we should start our conversation. You know, this anniversary has been a big deal. There have been conferences, there have been all kinds of events, there are publications. I have all these books to show you, sort of old-fashioned, but there's a beautiful book, 100 Years of James Joyce Ulysses, which my wonderful colleague Colin Tobin edited. And this is connected to an exhibition at the Morgan. Any of you are in New York or coming here, you can see it. It's a beautiful exhibit. It's got paintings, it's got manuscript pages and, you know, framed letters. But what I want to say about that, that's all great. But it really radiates the kind of canonicity of this book. This book is a kind of major thing in the world of art and ideas, and it is that. But when you read it, what you remember is that it's, you know, my copy, I think, you know, with the pages falling out and there's so many underlines that I should probably just look at the parts that aren't underlined. In some ways, that's more in the spirit of this book that is messy, that is unwieldy, it is unruly, it's spilling out its own sides. It can't decide what it wants to be. After about chapter 6, every chapter has a different format. One is written in the style of newspaper headlines. One is written in the style of a Harlequin romance. One is written as music. One is a kind of crazy hallucinogenic phantasmagoria. That's the longest chapter. It's half this book. Some are written in this kind of coded style. So there are all these different styles. It keeps getting, so they've got a chapter on gigantism where these got these enormous lists. And I always ask my students, what do you do with these? Can you read them? So it's kind of always spilling out of its own sides. And I think that sense of Ulysses as a kind of joyful overabundance in which you find what it is you want to do and how you want to approach this thing. You know, it's not that that's out of sync with the kind of super canonical, this is the great book you must read approach. Those things are both perhaps true. But to me, it's a slightly different sort of sensibility and it's funny, it's of course bawdy, crazy. We are not in the 60s or 70s anymore, but there was a 60s and 70s Ulysses as well. And the last thing I'll say, and then let's have some conversation, is that, you know, the sense of why it was banned, it's kind of sexual radicalness, it's assaults on norms of respectability, which bothered, although it also appealed to many of Joyce's literary contemporaries. Even those who were sympathetic to it were a little thrown off by it. But I don't know how some of that stands up. I will say that my students are less excited by the sexual liberation or liberatoriness of it and more kind of creeped out by Leopold Bloom sort of stalking women on the streets and, you know, looking at these younger women. So, you know, these sexual dynamics, which are so important to this book, there's a huge long sequence in which we kind of get these crazy sadomasochistic fantasies and all that. Those things are still flashpoints. They're still raw. They still get at some of our biggest problems and questions, the places where inequality and danger are very important in our own society as well. So it's not that it's relevance, if you want to call it that, or its livingness is all comfortable or joyful. It's difficult in these other ways too. And I think that's part of why it continues on. So I could just keep talking and talking, but why don't I stop and we will have a conversation.
Yeah, well, very nice introduction to the complexity of the book. Every time some expert talks about this book, I suddenly have a new perspective on the book. You mentioned impurity. I never thought of that part. But anyway, let's go through the list of the keywords I wanted to explore with you. And I would like to start with women.
Okay, right. Well, that's a good one. So I mentioned that Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus are the kind of paired consciousnesses that are at the center of the book. There's a concept, if you have any scientists here who maybe are astronomers, can explain what parallax in the astronomical world actually is, but it's a key term in the book. And from the literary point of view, it has to do with these two perspectives that are, you always need two perspectives to see one thing, and everything is in motion. So it's a kind of identity. But there are actually three key people. It's a trinity. And the third one is Molly Bloom, Leopold Bloom's wife, the mother of his living daughter, Millie, and their dead son, Rudy, who I want to make sure we talk about today, who would have been 11 at the time of on the day that it takes place, and who died when he was just a little over a week old. She is, I like to ask my students, what do you think? Is she a feminist hero? Is she a disappointing, woman who could only have been created by a man? She's obsessed with sex and the body. That's all she thinks about. She is certainly required to do a kind of archetypal thing here. She's acting as all women from the very first time we see her in the first chapter. The book is organized with the first 3 chapters are called a Telemachus, which is taking the Homeric parallel, is about Telemachus. We should talk about the Odyssean thing. That was the other thing I wanted to say in the intro, which I didn't. So the first 2 chapters are about Stephen, and then the next 12 are about the wanderings, as they call it, of Odysseus, or the Ulysses, and that's Bloom. And the first chapter there is called Calypso, and that's Leopold Bloom still at home in the morning, it's 8 o'clock in the morning, and he's making Molly, his wife, breakfast. She's in bed. It's where she ends at the end of the day as well. And so she is this creature of the bed. There's an adultery that happens around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and when Bloom comes home to his bed at around 3 o'clock in the morning, he finds the sort of evidence of that sex. We end the novel in Molly's consciousness. She gets the last word. It's a very long chapter. It's very famously only got 8 sentences and it's 40 pages. So it's a real stream of consciousness of Molly. And all of those transition points come with the word yes, which is also, of course, its final word. So she's a great affirmer. She affirms herself, she affirms her sexuality, she affirms her power, she affirms her love of Bloom, even though she's been having sex with someone else all day, and the 2 of them have not consummated their marriage, as we learned, for 10 years since the death of their son. So this is all to say that a lot on women and gender is kind of relying on and resting on Molly, who's also known as Penelope in the Homeric parallel. And you can see too that there's a truth to that in Odysseus's own wanderings, where he comes across a lot of women, divine, semi-divine, and otherwise over the course of his 10 years of wandering. But it's the final resting point for Odysseus is meant to be his home, and particularly his bed with Penelope. I'll just say, my students really range. Some of them really will have none of it. Others of them really still identify with her energy and power. There was a generation of feminist scholars in the 70s that really felt that the last chapter of Ulysses was the great, what they called écriture féminine, feminine writing of the 20th century. So I can't answer that question. I've always loved Molly. I used to think she was old. Then I thought she was the perfect age at 40. Now I think she's a kind of a young, a young mother. Other keywords you want to talk about?
Well, actually, let me explain why I want to start with women, because we underestimate the role of women in the history of literature. Would this novel exist without the support of those women? Margaret Anderson, you mentioned Sylvia Bleach, but Margaret Anderson, Jane Heap, and I don't remember the first name, Weaver.
Harriet Weaver. Yeah, I was, it's funny in my introduction when I mentioned Sylvia Bleach, I was going to say, side point, like in my parentheses, it's interesting to think about the women who made this book possible, and not just this book, but a lot of other books too. And I think we have to credit Joyce's wife, Nora, as well, and being, a complicated figure in his life, but also, someone who's a participant in many ways. So I would say, yes, that's absolutely true. I mean, the chapter that I mentioned earlier called Oxen of the Sun in the Homeric parallel, which traces the history of the English language, it's also a history of literature. There's not a single woman writer in that extremely long sequence that begins with kind of Latinate prose and comes up to this slang I was describing. And there are plenty of people that could have been there. What there is there is a woman's voice in that chapter, and that is the voice of Mrs. Purefoy, who's giving birth. That chapter takes place, a bunch of drunken men are in the waiting room of the maternity hospital where she's giving birth. And I think one way to read that whole thing is that you hear her screams in, birthing pain. It's been going on for 3 days. It's been a terrible, but then she does have the son and they're all celebrating. But in this patriarchal culture where the son's birth is, of course, the great one. But the point I was going to make is that there is a self-consciousness there about these men and this male apparatus of language that in some ways is designed to compete with this other thing that women do, which is reproduce and have babies and be mothers. And the figure of the mother is an interesting one throughout Ulysses, throughout all of Joyce's works, actually. I don't know if we want to jump in with the chat. I noticed somebody asked about the term metempsychosis, so I'll leave it to you, Piero, if you want me to answer that now.
Yeah, sure, if you want. Yeah, I haven't seen it.
Sure. So in that early chapter, Calypso, Bloom mentions this concept of metempsychosis, which basically
maybe before you get into it, just for those, I just got a message. For those who are not familiar, Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap published Ulysses in serial format, right? I don't remember the name of the magazine. And Weaver provided financial support.
Yes.
And Sylvia Bleach, you already mentioned, published the book in Shakespeare. Okay.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate your mentioning that. I have a former student actually, and a wonderful scholar named Liesl Olson, who's written a couple of books. And one of them is called it's called the Chicago Renaissance, I think is what it's called. And it's all about how she's focused on the city of Chicago, but it's all about how these mostly women kind of behind the publishing scenes effectively made modernism possible. And Joyce is one of the figures, well, he's not really in Chicago, but Gertrude Stein, Hemingway, there are a lot of male writers who are sort of, supported in this way by, philanthropists, women who are financially supporting this enterprise, as well as in the ways you're describing, editing and so on, helping, publishing. So yeah, I mean, I would say in terms of metempsychosis, which Molly's asking about it. One of the things we see right away when we hear Bloom explain what this concept means is that he's a good teacher. He kind of breaks it down. He tries to offer her language that she will understand. This comes in contrast to Stephen Dedalus, whom we've seen teaching 2 chapters before, who's a terrible teacher. He's just drifting off. He's not interested in students learning. He speaks in these weird parables and riddles they can't understand. So it's an interesting early moment where we see Bloom's character interacting with other people. He's a social character. Stephen is a solitary one. There are a lot of interesting contrasts between them. But I think of the importance of metempsychosis, which is also like reincarnation, to be really central to this book. And I'll tell you why. I think that it's part of the large idea of there being nothing that's ever new. Everything is recycled, reborn, reused. Starting with the frame, which is the Homer's Odyssey. One question people often ask is, why does he not call it Odysseus? Why does he call it Ulysses? Maybe he likes the sound better. Most likely, in my opinion, the choice of the Roman name rather than the Greek one is designed to highlight the way all of these narratives and stories and texts and ideas are translated and rethought each generation and on through time. So you have the Romans reading the Greeks, and then you have the English literary apparatus, which really took on this kind of Latinate version of it as their own. That now we're in Ireland. All stories are retold. It's a book that is much, much less committed to the idea of creation than it is borrowing, rewriting, evolving, the terms like that. So I think that, I mean, there's a lot we could say about the sort of religious dimension. We could talk about the classical dimension. But for me, what's most important about this is this idea that each product of a civilization is borrowed and is a kind of reboot from the previous one, or from many years before. It's this palimpsestic way that the past is always layered into the present and on into the future. And again, getting to this, this suspicion or antagonism toward purity. Nothing is pure. No word, no idea, no literary work is ever a kind of pure creation. This romantic idea that is from the romantic poets and writers and artists of the early 19th century, that literature is a kind of expression of the creative genius that you are inspired, whether it's by God or by something else or the west wind. And out of this kind of emerges poetry or art. That is a creed that Ulysses does not share. Everything is into the whirlwind and recycled. And the experience of reading this book, though it's an experience of unbelievable creative achievement, is also the experience. That's why you need the guidebooks and everything else. It's the experience of being in a place where each thing has already happened over and over again. And that's what makes it powerful. We end the novel back, as I mentioned, in the bed. But before that, when Bloom finally comes home, he comes home with Stephen. I love that chapter. I would love to talk about it if you want. When he gets there, he's back in his house with his own things. And one of the things that's so striking about it is that on the one hand, these are they're his, they tell his own family stories, but they tell other stories as well. All objects in this novel have been passed. They've been touched, they might be broken. There are stories there. There are previous owners, there are future owners. Everything is in the mix. And even the chapter Circe, which is, as I said, very difficult, this kind of crazy, wild phantasmagoria, which is just a plethora of more details and specifics than you could possibly try to understand or get a hold of. Everything is coming back. I say to my students in preparing to read it, where does everything go, in life? And the answer is not anywhere. It's always there waiting to come back. And that's part of the creed of the novel, is this sense of the unfinished business that is literature, that is life, that is humanity, that is language, that is culture.
Wow. Yeah, lots of meaning in this book.
Yes.
So my next topic would be war. Why war? Actually, let's combine war, history, and Ireland. So why? Because he lived at a really interesting time. We think our times are interesting, but imagine World War I. So World War I, which is pretty major. A lot of people died in World War I. Then the Irish Independence War, correct me if I'm wrong, 1919, 21. So just when it's finishing the book. The book is coming out serialized in 21. And then, again, from a historical point of view, 1917 is the Russian Revolution. I don't know how much impact it had outside Russia, but I think it was a major event. And then at the end, talking of powers, actually, at the end of World War I, the great Austrian Empire collapsed. That was another, culturally, we all know how important Austria was, right? Over the centuries. And then suddenly disappears, gets fragmented in the countries we're familiar now, Austria, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and so on. So this was a seismic event. And as far as Ireland goes, again, there was war going on in Ireland. And by the way, Joyce was in Trieste. Now, Trieste has a long history of being part of the Austrian Empire. So there must have been repercussions there, psychologically, if not political. And then as far as Ireland goes, correct me if I'm wrong, but he never wanted the Irish passport. Is that right? So what was, I mean, first of all, where do we find all these things in Ulysses? Was he so detached from what was going on? And then what was his connection with this Irish movement?
Yeah, well, there's a lot to say. We might want to separate the war and history a little bit from some of the Irish independence questions, which they overlap actually in some important ways, but they're also a little bit separated. But so my feeling about Ulysses, and this is something that's really developed over the years, is that I think it's a deeply pacifist book. It is a book that stands against war in every way and against violence. And in those ways, it overlaps some of the Irish history with this broader European history you're talking about and world history. There's the history chapter. Every chapter has a whole bunch of things associated with it. There's a color, there's a form of art, or what he calls it, like a discipline. After chapter 3, there's an organ of the body. There are particular characters. So the chapter that is affiliated officially with history is chapter 2. And that's still with Stephen, and he's teaching this class, and he's teaching about Roman history. And then he goes and sees his boss, who pays him, who's one of, I think, the kind of villains of Ulysses early on. His name is Mr. Daisy, and he's a horrible anti-Semite, and he keeps quoting Iago in Othello as if, in a positive way. And he also is one of these purity thinkers. He says there can be no two opinions on the subject, which, as I suggested already with Parallax, the whole point of this novel is there have to be at least two, probably hundreds. But in that chapter, Stephen is teaching about Pyrrhus and the concept of the Pyrrhic victory. But mostly what he's doing is ruminating on the savagery and the savageness of war. He thinks about bodies strewn on the battlefield of gore and death and loss. And that's a preoccupation of his. Later in the next chapter, he's wandering around Sandymount Beach, and he has these wonderful sort of meditations on the long past that is emblematized by what's in the sea and by the sand. And he thinks of sort of men's ashes and all this lost, drowned armadas at sea and so forth. And it's kind of really visceral, material way that the body is, again, recycled. It's still there. Nothing is, again, ever gone. So for Stephen, and then there are other images of disaster. In the first chapter, when we see Bloom, he goes walking around as he makes breakfast. He goes out to the pork butcher, good Jew that he is. And he has this kind of dark, desolate vision of the Holy Land. And he also thinks about these kind of terrible historical events. There are images throughout the book of slaughtered animals. There's a whole thing about cows and cattle being slaughtered. Bloom, who's the first line about him, Mr. Leopold Bloom ate with relish the inner organs of beasts and fowls. He's a meat eater. He gets disgusted and has a vegetarian lunch later. And what he gets disgusted by is the eating, but also by the sight of these sweating policemen who are kind of trundling by. And it reminds him of being in a protest where they were beating innocent protesters. Be very resonant again for today. And then we could move all the way to Circe, which I would like to talk about in terms of war and the violence in Ireland. But all this is to say that Joyce is not taking the view of history as some kind of, anodyne place in the past where we find the stories that we want. It's dark and messy. When Stephen says history is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake, that's like a kind of a quotable quote, but that comes out of this deep reflection on war. And the other thing I want to say about that is that it's very important that this book takes the Odyssey and not the Iliad as its guide. I mean, in the 19th century, the Iliad was the great epic. That was the one that all the kids had to read in school. They read them both, but it was really Achilles. It was the battles of Troy. It was the war and the glory of war and the pity of war and all the war things that, define the epic. And in a way, that's more of an epic than this one. It's got the catalog of ships. So it's got hundreds of protagonists who are all in some ways heroic and problematic, but mostly heroic. And this is not that. This is the post-war epic. This is the epic about the fallout from war, about the long homecoming, about loss and death and sorrow, of everything you've missed when you were on the battlefield, of the desire to have it all over finally, the continued losses on the way home. So this is not, these are epics that, and Joyce's emphasis there about homecoming and about, you know, a protagonist who is himself very pacifist over key moments. And then let me just say one last thing about this, and this brings in the Ireland stuff a little bit. So the chapter in which, there are a lot of chapters in which the sort of Irish nationalist questions are raised. The chapter in the library I mentioned, and one of your questioners asks about his theory of Hamlet, which I can try to answer a little bit if you want. But in that chapter in the library, they're all the kind of luminaries, the actual real people. By the way, this book has a combination of fictional people, semi-fictional people, and actual people. I don't know how he got away with it, honestly. But anyway, so some of the various luminaries of the Irish Renaissance are there in the library, and Stephen, who wants to kind of be one of them, but disdains them, isn't invited to the party. Literally, there's a party that night at Singh's house. He's not invited. He's feeling kind of bad about it. And somebody says, well, the great epic of Ireland hasn't been written yet. Another one of these kind of self-conscious quotes that people point to. So that's one version of a kind of cultural nationalism that Joyce, about which Joyce was extremely ambivalent, as is Stephen. And Bloom is a little bit, suspicious, or, he's not really part of that group either. That episode leads into one in the newspaper offices, in which there are there's always a group of men talking about things. And in this case, they're talking about these great orators from Ireland's past. And they're also talking about the ways in which various anti-colonial events were kind of secretly encoded into newspapers so that could be published in this kind of coded way. So there's a whole Fenian, and Simon and his friends are Fenians. So there is a kind of theme about rebellion. But the big chapter that takes on nationalism directly is Cyclops. And it's extremely controversial and interesting that Joyce makes the big ultra-nationalist, who's based on Michael Cusack, who's the founder of the Gaelic Athletic Association and other sort of Irish Renaissance associations that were really important in the kind of cultural nationalist movement that really got the whole revolution going. He's the Cyclops. He's violent. We all know the story of the Cyclops, Polyphemus, the antagonist to Odysseus. And indeed, Bloom is hounded in that chapter. The anti-Semitism that floats through the whole novel reaches a kind of crescendo there. And in that chapter, Bloom says, I'm for love and against war. They say, what's your definition of a nation? And he says, it's people living in the same place or different places. So they all ridicule him and laugh. They say, what's your nation? He says, Irish. I'm Irish. I was born here. So it's this very unideological idea of Irishness that this novel embraces. I think embraces. I mean, you could argue that that's just Bloom. It's one person, but I think that's the ethos of the novel. And the running comparison between sort of Jewish homelands and Irish homelands are very interesting and complicated, and Bloom's sort of status as an outsider, as a Jewish person, and for other reasons. But I mentioned this to say that in this book, the sort of heroic nationalist program is just not given credence, and it's really, it makes a statement. At the same time, when you get all the way to Circe, this is the chapter that takes place in the red light district. All kinds of crazy things are happening. And at the end of it, Stephen and Bloom finally come together. And they're sort of wandering around as parallels and occasionally seeing each other. They don't really know each other. They've met a few times. And they finally, all Stephen's friends are actually not friends, have abandoned him, and he's drunk and starving. He hasn't eaten all day. And so Bloom finally takes care of him. Anyway, at the end of the chapter, he gets into an argument with a couple of British soldiers, and one of them punches him in the face. And again, through the just insanity of that chapter, I cannot, convey it without, if you haven't read it or looked at it, that stands out, that moment of imperial violence. And there's some kind of apocalyptic scenes in that chapter of Dublin burning. The only other historical event that you didn't mention in your survey that really matters there is the Rising, which of course took place in Dublin, and where there was fighting for a whole week in the streets, which takes place historically after the novel is set, but during the time of its composition and before it was its final publication. So it's a kind of ghost there. And I think, again, the sort of pacifist stance of the novel is to say no. But at the same time, to recognize that powerful and painful history, and that history that kind of creates a city or maybe a people. I could say more, but maybe we want to take some more questions or do some more.
Yeah, you can. So you have two questions in the chat,
Right.
One in the QA. Let's take the first one in the chat about Stephen's
Hamlet.
theory of Hamlet and in general Shakespeare.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. And since we have limited time, I'll just say a couple of things about it. First of all, Hamlet has central billing because Stephen is thinking a lot about Hamlet and has this theory which he finally articulates. Right in the first chapter, his not friends say, oh, tell us about your theory of Hamlet. And so everybody kind of knows he's working on this thing. But Shakespeare in general permeates the novel. There's a chapter 3, Proteus, and other chapters like that, which are very interested in kind of flux and movement and change, are very indebted to the Tempest, and a lot of echoes there. I mentioned Othello earlier, and we could just go on and on. But Hamlet gets central billing. So the theory of Hamlet is, and of Shakespeare, it's not just of Hamlet, that Stephen propounds, is essentially that all of these stories are personal, that the story of Hamlet is actually about Shakespeare's son Hamnet, who died. It's about his continued complicated relationship with Anne Hathaway. It's about his own sexual experiences and life. This is totally anathema to 19th century and early 20th century views of Shakespeare. Shakespeare was the great universalist. Shakespeare was a lot of things. He was not a person whose life mattered. And, you know, the great Shakespearean Stephen Greenblatt told me once about this, that he thought this was the greatest, one of the most, if not the most brilliant theory of Hamlet that he'd ever read. And that makes sense because Stephen Greenblatt is one of the sort of founding thinkers of what became known as the New Historicism, which was a way of reading literature that kind of re-embedded it into the kind of particularities of its moment and into the kind of rough and tumble of its history, but also of the author's own complicated history. And so it's I was talking about earlier, ways in which reading the novel is so amenable to our own time. And I find the reading of Hamlet to be like that. It feels timely and urgent and compelling in a way that it was radical and uncomfortable 100 years ago. And the listeners to Stephen's theory reject it. They say, no way, because they have come out of a very different era. So in that sense, it's kind of ahead of its time. Then again, they say, do you believe this to Stephen? And he says, no. So there's this whole question of sort of, you know, these free-floating theories and ideas that are propounded and then rejected, getting back to a larger question of how we know what to take seriously in this massive book. There are questions in the Q&A part I haven't.
Yeah, so the question in the QA is the presence of Pound in Joyce as a writer, and in particular in Ulysses.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that Pound, you know, I don't know all the details of the Pound-Joyce relationship, but it is, I mean, he was very much of a presence. I mean, I think in the very personal way, I don't know. But, you know, Pound saw Joyce as a figure that should be celebrated. He tried to help him out of his financial difficulties and some of the legal difficulties. So Pound as a kind of intellectual mentor, you know, the thing about Ulysses is it's hard to see the real presence of his peers in the book. I mean, for example, in the chapter of where I mentioned where all these styles are evolved, it jumps from the late 19th century to this slang. There's no mention of modernism. There's no Eliot, there's no Pound, there's no, anybody from his own current, or Yeats, notable omission. So I think, there is always that kind of sui generis quality there. It's not probably personally true, but at the level of sort of the book's bursting, identifications. Somebody had a question. I wanted just to make sure I didn't lose it. Has it ever been read not only as a celebration of impurity, but also as an expose thereof, tattling on the occult mechanisms of international capital? Whether or not Joyce intended to influence, seems to have read it that way, at least in his younger years when he was up in arms about Freemasonry. I'm not totally sure what the question is about international capital, but I will say, and maybe this does or doesn't accord with the question, that one of the things that's really interesting in the book is its multiple economies. It's a full of people of these sort of shadow economies, debt. Everybody's in debt to everybody else. People have borrowed money. Bloom is trying to get someone to pay him back. There's the charitable donations. At the center of the thing, by the way, is a funeral. We haven't even talked about that. And one of the big themes I had hoped we might get to is death and life, big ones. But they're taking charitable donations. There's horse racing and betting. There are lotteries and lottery tickets. We learned that when Leopold Bloom and Molly Bloom were younger, they sold secondhand clothes out of their house to make ends meet. People are musicians. Molly's a musician. She's kind of going on tour in this sort of semi-professional way. So that's more I suppose, the legitimate economy. And then there's the huge scene in what he calls Night Town, the red light district. Prostitution is a huge theme and question all throughout. So there is, and you get this in Dubliners too, there is a quality of a kind of localness to the economy in a way in which these characters are not, it's not that they're slipping out of global capitalism, but that there are these sort of alternatives. Bloom is an ad canvasser and he's going out trying to sell this advertisement. When you're in the part of the book in the newspaper offices, one of the things that's so interesting is that there's no attempt to separate the advertisements from the news content the way we might think today we're supposed to do. Advertising is a major concept in the novel. There is a sort of more than a suggestion. The novel is exploring the way advertising creates the economy of desire that we all have. The chapter Nausicaa, which treats this lovely, interesting woman, Gertie McDowell, the first half of it is her kind of stream of consciousness, and she's formed almost entirely by women's magazines and kind of what we would think of as kind of harlequin sentimental novels. That's all bound up with buying creams and, cosmetics. So it's a very knowing book about the way capitalism works to create our human selves, to create our identities, to teach us what we want, things that are very familiar to us 100 years later. And at the same time, it's interested in these kind of local resistances to the imperial and capitalist economy. There's all this wonderful stuff about time, that official Dublin time when the book is set, not when it's actually published, was 35 minutes before London time, so perfect. And this creates all kinds of complicated things about news and horse race news and so on. But there is that sense all the time of, well, let's put it this way, there's a kind of question or almost a dialectic of a city that is a subject city, that is subject to its colonial rulers and accepting it, bowing to it, subject in a certain way, and one that, on the other hand, is rebellious, is in its various different ways, fighting that or opposing it in little and large ways. And so this idea of the kind of imperial global economy is partly about the subjection of Ireland. I mean, as we know, the Irish economy was decimated by British policies in the 19th century, the forced agrarianism, the reliance on the potato. We all know this history. And so does this book. And in fact, I'll say one more thing, and I know we're running out of time here, but the Cyclops, Cusack person, though, as I said earlier, he's kind of the villain, like everything else, things are mixed here. He does articulate an economic nationalism that is very powerful. And he talks about the British destruction of all of these local Irish industries. And, you know, he rattles through them in his, the theme or the sort of mode of that chapter is what Joyce called gigantism. So everything happens in these kind of parodies that are these huge long lists. So, but that's one of the parodic lists that's very compelling and true. So I think, you know, it is a massive critique of this world of advertising and you know, colonial imperial control, but it's also one in which the kind of sheer gusto of this space finds its own alternatives. You know, there are a lot of people who are right on the brink of disaster in Ulysses. You see it even more in Dubliners. Dubliners is a very harsh portrait and a very searing, I should say, portrait of a kind of class of people who are right, you know, as I say, kind of on the brink of destitution. And you do see that here. The kind of class at the center of this novel is very interesting, kind of lower middle class. And there are people who are sinking. We see them on the streets. They've kind of fallen out. They're almost homeless. They're drunks or whatever. And that sense of being kind of right on the edge of a sort of economic and social abyss is very powerful here. And I think there's social critique as well. But of course, Joyce won't let himself, he's not going to write a protest novel of the sort that, you know, I've been teaching Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and he's not going down that road. I think you're going to find the critique in a more complex way. And it is very powerful here. And certainly postmodernism sees itself as the kind of, and post-structuralism as the kind of follow-up of Joyce. Derrida apparently said that everything he'd ever written was a footnote to Ulysses. And, you know, you could see why that would be.
Okay, I still have a lot of things to discuss. It's 10 p.m. in New York, so it's up to you when we stop. It's not up to us. So just give me a warning when you're getting tired, because there's 3 questions I don't want to miss. I'm leaving 2 for the end.
Okay, well, why don't we do a couple more and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, 3 more.
Okay, 3 more. Okay,
one is because we want to get to some science. So medicine, anatomy, disease. Why I'm asking this question? Well, again, historical context, the Spanish flu, the big yes. pandemic of a century ago. It was living through it. And anatomy, why anatomy? Oh, by the way, medicine, why medicine? I think he was thinking of studying medicine at one point. Anatomy, well, he himself called it the epic of the human body. Yes. And then there's Stuart Gilbert's famous schema where, you know, he associates each chapter to an organ.
Yes.
And okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's also other science. There's astronomy and that kind of thing, and he's very interested in, and Ithaca, which is one of my favorite chapters, is you know, quite taken with those scientific, you know, enterprises. Yes, yes is the answer to that. It is all about that. The human body has never. This is, I mean. You might say, what kind of an epic is this? What's an epic of? And one answer could be of the human body. You're right about Joyce wanting to study medicine. I think that, you know, I've been reading H.G. Wells, as you mentioned. I wrote a book on Wells. So comparatively speaking, I don't find Joyce particularly interested in biology, particularly well-schooled in science. You know, these are comparative things. Wells studied science and was studying to be a teacher of science and so forth. But, you know, they're different. I guess I would say that Joyce's way of approaching the body is probably, I mean, I'm sure he'd read lots of biology because he read everything, but it's to me less about a kind of very direct engagement with the way these scientific disciplines are developing, and more about recognizing the sort of ecology of the human experience. And so the way the different systems of the body work, the way the systems of the body have kind of parallels in the system of a city or of a community. These things, these are sort of organizing features. He's so interested in the body. One of my favorite chapters is Hades, which is the one in which they actually get to the funeral. They go in the funeral procession, and then they actually have the funeral. And Bloom is doing a lot of his very Bloomian, thinking and commenting. And he keeps thinking about what happens to the body after death, and like about its gases and its organs and this kind of cheesiness. It's really disgusting. But he's trying to be very sort of biological in a chapter that is absolutely consumed with the rituals of death, the ceremonies, the personnel, everything that goes on to sort of make death mean something other than just a rotting body in the ground. Bloom himself, I see as a kind of scientist. I mean, in Ithaca, where we get the second to last chapter, which is written all as Q&A, and Joyce described its kind of scheme as catechism. It's wonderful because it's written as questions and answers. Once it asks a question, it has to answer them. So a lot of mysteries that have been sort of left uncertain throughout the novel are answered there. But anyway, in one of its little formulations, it describes Stephen as artist and Bloom as scientist. And we see that from the very, very beginning with Bloom. He's always asking questions. He's an empiricist. He's trying to figure things out based on his experience of it, based on a kind of study. And he has a kind of armchair or like school level science. He's thinking about Archimedes. He's trying to remember these rules and laws, and he's wearing a black suit. It's a warm day, and he's thinking, is it hot because it reflects or refracts? That's very Bloom all the way through. So he's a kind of, he's a kind of scientific thinker. That is his mentality. He's always asking questions. Wonder if. And one of the wonderful connections is the one he's figured and sees himself as a wandering Jew, but also a wondering person, a wanderer and a wanderer. When we get all the way to the end, when Stephen and Bloom come together in Ithaca, we find what I see as this kind of wonderful amalgamation of science with a certain kind of wondrousness or awe, the awe that science can be, but also a way of kind of bringing a certain type of aesthetic or poetic sensibility to the amazing just reality of how the world works. I guess that's what I would say, that in some ways, this is an epic of how the world works. And that's what Bloom is interested in. Stephen can be brought to bear on that. The pandemic is a great question. I mean, there's a wonderful book called Viral Modernism by my friend Elizabeth Autka. And her question is, where is the flu in modernism? Modernism was a movement of this exact period. Everyone's obsessed with World War I, but as we know, the flu killed way more people. Maybe it was 50 million people, maybe it was 100 million people. Why doesn't anyone write about it? Where is it? And her answer is, it's here and there. And she finds it, and it's very interesting. And she sees it as a kind of shadow. But I think, there are visions of plagues and pandemics and things that run throughout this book. I was talking about this kind of imagination of disaster that both Stephen and Bloom have. So it is interesting to think about it. I haven't gone through and read the whole book beginning to end since 2020. So I bet if I did now, I would be very interested. As I was saying earlier, it keeps repaying wherever you are now. So yes, I would say biology and science and all the many different kinds of sciences, but really in the interest of a kind of big human picture.
Okay, you have to solve a mystery for us. Who is the man in the Macintosh? It keeps popping up in some chapters, and then it disappears after 2 sentences.
Yeah, so the man in the Macintosh is a great example of another thing I wanted to talk about, but haven't had a chance to, which is a kind of interesting I keep using the word dialectic, a kind of two different emphases that are oppositional and kind of warring, as it were, or competing in the novel. One is the rage to order, to categorize, to create encyclopedias and lists, and imagine you can somehow contain all of the world if you just formalize it properly or organize it properly. And on the other hand, the just wildness of this book, which cannot be contained. It's full of errors. And I don't mean errors that in the typography and in the editing, but errors within the text itself, like within the world of the text itself. And so one of them is this Macintosh. So we're at the funeral and Bloom sees a man in a Macintosh, like a raincoat, and thinks, who's the man in the Macintosh? And then they're taking, I forget exactly which person is taking down notes of who was there. And there's one of these kind of broken conversation. He says, who was? And Bloom says, yes, Macintosh. And he's like, okay, Macintosh. So he writes it down as one of the attendees. And when we finally get to the newspaper at 2 o'clock in the morning, many, many, many hours later, and we see the official, kind of rundown of the funeral, there's someone named Macintosh who's there. So that got coded into that little wordplay got coded into the official record. Leopold Bloom's name is misspelled. People who weren't there are there, people who are there aren't there, and so forth. So I like to see this as part of the just pure play of this novel, the way errors and mistakes and confusions are just part of it. What is this postcard UP up that somebody has received? Is it a hoax? Is it some kind of meaning? Stephen has kept his telegram from his father, come home, another, and with an N, not an M, dying, as a kind of curio. Seems rather heartless, but he finds it somehow amusing that there's this misprint. And the whole novel is just full of such things. Macintosh, the man in Macintosh, shows up, of course, in Circe, as everyone does. So my answer to that is, we would never know, and that's part of the joy of it all, is that, and that makes you wonder, what you have to figure out in a way what you're going to care about in this novel. What are you going to trace? Which line are you going to follow? Which, map are you going to adhere to? And that there are sort of infinite numbers, and some of them are going to be wrong. Mistakes are part of life. And I think that's part of what's so beautiful about this novel, is that it seems to be obsessed with control and getting it right. And then it also builds in all these things that are wrong. And some of it is more sinister, like Mr. Daisy gets all his history wrong. And that's more problematic because he's got all these views that he's using to, blame Jews for things and so on. All right, last question, and I need to go eat dinner.
Yes, talking of play, let me check if my theory makes any sense. It's not really a theory, it's a joke, but is it possible that the real Ulysses is the reader who has to struggle through such a complex and difficult text?
Wait, say that again, I'm sorry.
Is it possible that the real Ulysses in this novel is the reader who has to read such a difficult book?
Yes, it's true. I mean, I think I was suggesting earlier that by the time my students get to the end of it, they're proud of themselves, they're excited, they feel like they've done something and been somewhere. I've never had a student say that they regret having done this thing. So there is that sense that the reader, and I mean, there are a lot of ways you could say that, that it's not just that the reader is the epic, hero or whatever, the epic wanderer, but also that the text itself is its own subject. Almost, I would say actually every chapter in some way is a kind of allegory for itself. And so it's not just a kind of Derridian self, reflection or whatever, but it is also really a taking seriously of this project of reading and doing, being in this literary text and world. So I think that's right. It's just, I mean, it's a great joy. It's something that you usually would want to do, in a group with these guidebooks. You want to talk about it. You don't want to passively read it and listen to someone else telling you about it. It's an extremely, it's a book that asks for and demands an active reader. It wants you to engage in these kinds of questions. And the last thing I'll say about that, about the reader, is that, it does push hard. I mean, there are parts of it that are almost illegible. As we know with Finnegan's Wake, Joyce kept going in that direction. Ulysses is kind of right on the edge where it doesn't ever quite descend into that. But even chapters like Proteus, which is one of the ones where you're most deeply in Stephen's intellectual, miasma, he's thinking about how in his thought stream, words are becoming almost just sounds, kind of extra linguistic. And this comes up again in Sirens, which is the chapter about music, which is also really hard to read. It's got a kind of overture, and a lot of the chapters have like little bits from other chapters that stick in there that only make sense when you've read it later. There's this concept of retrospective arrangement, which keeps coming back, which suggests how you have to keep going back to understand what you just read, not only going forward. So there's a kind of temporality. And so it really is, it's an undertaking. But what's so great about it is that it just keeps giving back and giving back and giving back and giving back. And so it's not the only thing that happened in 1920s writing or 20th century writing, and it's not necessarily the best one for everybody, but it's something that it does make you as a reader. It's if you like accomplishments. I'm not a marathon runner, but those of you on the Zoom who are, that's what this is. But then again, I run every day, and it's for you too. It's the every day, for week in and week out, I'm going to do this thing. And I think it's really rewarding. So I hope there are many Ulysses readers, past, present, and future here. And, thank you for the chance to talk about it. There's a lot out there right now on Ulysses and a lot of opportunities to engage with it.
Okay, bravo. If we had a live audience now, there would be a big round of applause. Wonderful job. Thank you very much. Thank you for staying up till past 10.
No problem. Right, now I get to read. Have a wonderful night, everybody.
Okay, thank you.